You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 22, The Manhunt. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Norman Lau.
And I'm Earl Green. Each week on Gene-ology, we fan out in a standard search pattern, trying to find any morals, meanings, and messages that a young Gene Roddenberry may have planted in his earliest works as a TV writer.
This week, the search leads us back to West Point, the 1950s military series where Gene was a staff writer. Earl will be back with trivia in a moment if he doesn't get lost in the thick underbrush of the studio. But first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, just barely being scraped by the tooth of a rattlesnake, here is Earl Green with this week's trivia.
Thank you, Norman. I'll need medical attention immediately. But in the meantime, here's trivia. We're now into a part of West Point where it's hard to find non-conflicting information about where in the season this episode fell, or exactly when in 1957 it aired. Was it episode 16 like IMDb says, or was it episode 27? Unlike The Command, this episode was written by Gene alone, with no one else credited for either script or story. James Best guest stars as Cadet Carl Plasek. James had plenty of history with West Point even before he appeared in 2 episodes of the show as 2 different characters. He himself had served in the Army during World War II and then embarked on an acting career. He had also appeared in 1952's film Francis Goes to West Point, but the real star of that film was Francis the Talking Mule. James racked up plenty of acting roles on the big screen and small, but 2 things in hindsight may have been seen as a hindrance to his career. Persistent health issues that sidelined him for many years, and a distinct Southern accent that he could never quite shake, leaving him to be typecast as country types and frequently less intelligent characters. During his downtime due to health issues, James set himself up as a renowned acting coach and also explored writing. But his career took a major upswing in 1979 when he was cast as the bumbling Sheriff Roscoe P. Coltrane on The Dukes of Hazzard and various reunion movies after the series ended. And he put in an appearance as a guest star on the Dukes of Hazzard spin-off Enos. He also revived Roscoe as a voice actor in both animated form and in video games based on the series. He also took the opportunity to explore directing and was behind the camera for 3 episodes of Dukes of Hazzard. We lost James in 2015. Whoever drew up the end credits on West Point this week was legally required to tell you that guest star Peter Baldwin appeared through the courtesy of Paramount Pictures. Unlike his co-star, Peter was a Navy man who signed with Paramount as a contract player in 1951, and under that system, if you were loaned out to another studio, such as Ziv television programs, it was customary for the studio borrowing you to include that in the credits. Peter appeared through the courtesy of Paramount in no fewer than 3 West Point episodes, 2 as Cadet Dick Milestone, and 1 episode as another character. Milestone's other appearance was in a script by writer David P. Harmon, and right there you have a Star Trek connection, as David would later write the episodes The Deadly Years and A Piece of the Action. Peter's acting resume is brief but varied, whether it's roles in Stalag 17 or The 10 Commandments, or roles in movies with lurid titles like The Girls of Pleasure Island, or I Married a Monster from Outer Space. Peter wisely decided to concentrate his efforts in directing, and that part of his resume is vast. Many episodes of Gomer Pyle and The Andy Griffith Show, The Partridge Family, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Sanford and Son, The Brady Bunch, Chico and the Man, The Bob Newhart Show, Full House, Murphy Brown, The Wonder Years, Blossom, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, among many, many others, well over 100 directing credits in a career spanning 4 decades behind the camera. Not unlike his character in this episode, Peter pretty quickly found what he was good at. We lost him in 2017.
What do you think, Major?
We can hope he's been picked up by a hunting party or stumbled onto a highway.
If he hasn't?
He should be in traumatic shock by now. He'll need water, warmth, and rest.
It's cold already. Can he live through the night?
I don't know, Captain. Lost, in pain, he'll be frightened. Depends on what kind of person he is when that wears off.
Act 1. Cadet Lieutenant Thompson of Company M2 welcomes us back to West Point, kitted out in standard Army field gear. It provides some warmth in cold weather, but Thompson points out that survival in the cold, in an emergency, depends on the training of the man wearing the uniform. It's not simply a case of clothes maketh the man. We then meet Cadet Dick Milestone, well liked by his fellow cadets, but they're also well aware of his shortcomings, such as his performance on the firing range. His roomie, Cadet Carl Plachik, is sighting in Dick's rifle in advance of a hunting trip they're going on tomorrow. The other cadets scoff. You can sight in a rifle all you like, but it can only compensate for so much. And as Carl and Dick pack for their trip, the fact that Dick has forgotten to pick up ammo, well, it kind of makes it sound like the other cadets have a point about him. Once the ammo's taken care of, the 2 cadets are off hiking until they can find a place to make camp. But the trip is also a practical exercise in many areas of Army training, from handling firearms to outdoor tracking skills. And, Carl notices, suddenly it seems like Dick is good at things, which is great while they're hunting and camping, but where is this competence in the classroom and in basic training? Dick figures he just can't hack it under pressure. Carl thinks it's time Dick got mad at himself to improve his performance. A little target practice seems to prove Dick's point. It seems as though he didn't hit the target at all. Carl checks the sight on the rifle Dick was using, and while Dick goes back to camp to grab more ammo, while he's gone, Carl discovers Dick did hit the target 3 times, pretty close to dead center. That's when Carl hears the first shot, and the second, and the third, and more. Somewhere, Dick is firing his rifle repeatedly, and Carl races to see what's happening. It turns out Dick is firing the rifle at a rattlesnake. When Carl checks Dick's leg, he finds the snake bit him. After a little bit of emergency first aid, Carl bundles Dick up in the tent and tells him to stay put. Carl's going to hike down to the highway, flag down a car headed for West Point, and then he's going to bring back emergency help. But even though Carl thinks he's administered first aid quickly enough, Dick Milestone is not doing too well. He's running a high fever, and he's in real trouble. When Carl returns with MPs and medics, the tent is empty. He has to inform the captain and the major heading up the rescue party that he doesn't know what's happened to Cadet Dick Milestone. Act 2. It's now a search and rescue mission. An entire battalion of cadets is called up from West Point to search on foot for their missing man. There's snow on the ground, it'll be well below freezing, and it's officially an emergency. And where is Cadet Dick Milestone? He awakens on the ground, woken by the sound of a search and rescue helicopter passing overhead, but not seeing him. He continues wandering but can't seem to find any of the cadets who are looking for him. He finally sits down due to the pain from his leg. Dick uses just about everything the Army has taught him to stay warm and survive through the night, building a small campfire and covering himself with leaves for warmth. In the morning, the helicopter is overhead again, and Dick sets the leaves that kept him covered on fire, creating enough smoke that the chopper finally spots him. Back at West Point, both Dick and Carl are on a little bit of medical leave, but Carl is actually the worse for wear out of the two. He's proud of his roomie. Life took a swing at Dick Milestone, and he punched back and survived. The end.
Well done, Norman. We're just warming back up now that we're in from the cold, and the search and rescue mission is over at last. Now, as always, we find a few things that made us chuckle, or made us think, in some cases. But yeah, we try not to just snark the episode to death, but there's a lot to talk about here.
Mm-hmm. We love the fashion in West Point. I have to say that Charles Thompson's opening sequence, he's talking about cold weather gear. It's the standard Army field jacket, which I think is gorgeous, by the way. And then we cut into the rifle sequence where Carl's training with his rifle and sighting Dick's rifle just to make sure that it's worthy of their hunting expedition. And he's wearing this really cool padded jacket. It's padded in the shoulder for the buttstock to recoil into, but also there's a padding on the elbow. So I guess because you're doing this so often, you don't want to wear out your own clothes or obviously injure your elbow or callus it. So I thought that was really cool. You get to see some of that stuff. Now, I know that Dick Milestone's, he's an excitable plebe, right? But maybe this is a little too, telegraphed or forced. But he forgot the ammo for a hunting trip that he's supposed to go on. Let me just put it this way. For a West Point cadet, it's a little far-fetched, but it's really easy to understand in terms of a narrative.
Yeah, I suppose you've got to do something to introduce a little bit of levity into it, because it gets kind of heavy later on. However, this made me think, we were talking about our two leads. Should they have switched roles? Should we have had James Best as Dick Milestone? And I hate to say this, given that we just had this whole conversation in trivia about that he couldn't get roles because of his southern accent once the Western fell out of favor with Hollywood. Should we have had James Best going, golly, I forgot my ammunition?
The thing is that James is slightly older looking, so I think it leans into the whole dynamic of him being kind of the older looking, the older brother. I'm going to get to that a lot in discussion, and he just has a little bit more presence, I think, than the actor who played Dick. He's a little bit more, he's younger, he's a little bit more neat. It's kind of like the whole young bulldog thing we see in Tom and Jerry cartoons, Spike the big bulldog getting nipped at the heels by the little bulldog. Okay, this is another thing that I thought was interesting. When Dick and Carl were, packing themselves up and getting their gear strapped on, Carl traipses off like an expert cadet. And then, Dick has to kind of roll his eyes backwards and track backwards and say, oh my God, I forgot my rifle too, and picks it up off the ground. So there's a little bit, again, because we're in a 27-minute format, there's a lot of economy that has to be written in that seems a little almost awkwardly forced in for a cadet of West Point to do these things,
Yeah. Now, we have a rattlesnake that is a major plot point in this episode, and the thing that keeps it from hitting the classic TV trifecta of threat is that there is not also quicksand and a visit to the Bermuda Triangle. Or you could swap out tarantulas for one of those threats, too. But up until about 81 or 82, TV conditioned us to think that poisonous snakes, quicksand, and the Bermuda Triangle were going to be a much bigger problem in our lives than they turned out to be. Now, going back to the tarantulas, that brings me back to a time a tarantula dropped down in front of me while I was working in the barn at a horse farm. It didn't freak me out. They're not exactly zippy little guys. They've got to crawl up to you, and you can put a lot more distance between you and that spider than it can cover in a short amount of time. And so I had time to think to myself, oh, wow, a real live tarantula. And then I remembered, oh yeah, I don't want it to buy any of these horses, some of which are more expensive to replace than I am. And so, smoosh, I smacked it with a shovel. No more tarantula. Didn't freak out. I located the correct tool for the job and took care of business. So, this brings me to Dick shooting an M1 rifle repeatedly at the rattlesnake. I guess if the gun is literally the only thing within reach, and he did say the snake just kind of brushed his leg and caught him by surprise. But, again, from working on a horse farm, I can tell you this. If you have a shovel, and I think a lot of field packs, especially these days, that the military would be carrying in this situation, they have expandable shovels. You can fold them out, lock the handle into place at the joints. It's a shovel. And that is what you use if you have a snake problem. You try to keep a safe distance, and you hate to gross anyone out who hasn't had to deal with this. You take the snake's head off with the shovel, with the pointed head of the shovel. You try not to give it a chance to get close enough to bite. And if you remove the head, you remove the threat. So all of this is to say, I almost certainly was not supposed to laugh when we found out that Dick was shooting at a snake, but I did laugh. It goes back to something my grandfather used to say after I introduced him to the term freaking out, and he said, freaking out is the enemy of getting stuff done.
Oh, I like that. That's very cool. But again, because certain signature moments in kind of like the character arc building of Dick Milestone have to be so consolidated and concentrated, all of his reactions to things are a little overdone, even for scripts that that Gene wrote, because I think at this point in time in West Point we feel that he's a little bit more deft of a writer.
So Dick is like the guy in the infomercial who can't make it to his easy chair with the bowl full of popcorn without falling all over himself.
This is the guy.
He's that guy.
This is that guy. He's that guy. This guy was the real deal. Speaking of real deal, I really like how Carl uses the target flag as the tourniquet to tie around Dick's leg to slow down the current of poison that's rising up his leg. Because I think that maybe you felt about it the same way. I'm wondering if this is going to pay off later. Like the token, that the student finds to summon his courage.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned.
I did like how Carl took one of the heated rocks from the fire pit and put that into Dick's sleeping bag to warm it up. It reminded me of the old ways that they would put coals from a fire into a pan and slide it underneath, the mattresses so that it would warm the mattresses. Like in that way, there was no air conditioning or heating back then, no HVAC in castles. So I thought that was kind of neat.
We'll get into this more in discussion, but I really feel like someone handed Gene this whole list of things from the Army Survival Manual and said, please work this into your script. Of course, what would have heated that rock up even better would have been a Type 2 phaser.
I was thinking about Sulu, in The Enemy Within the entire time. It's like, can you also send down a pot of hot coffee? Also good. Upon receiving the news that Dick may have wandered off in a state of, toxic delirium, you saw this incredible mobilization montage. And we're talking like, as soon as that news came in over the wire, it was spread throughout the campus PA system like wildfire. And everyone suited up, trucked out to go find this. And I thought that was really interesting, coming back to a point that we were trying to get across in the command when we were talking about Army of One. And this is what I was trying to explain, that my friend told me that the Army of One motto was, you act as one, but you're the multitude of the army, because they all went out and they were all trained to do this one thing that they all were just ordered to achieve. And that was find Dick Milestone. I thought it was kind of neat, going back to what that probably originally meant.
See, you're thinking Army of One. I'm thinking leave no man behind.
Well, that too. I think they both mean the same thing for the same reason.
Right. Now, the one thing about the rattlesnake, going back to this, I can't leave the snake alone. One thing about the rattlesnake that bothered me is that you would normally see them in warmer weather. And that brings me to this. Dick sleeping in a bed of leaves. Now, maybe this is me being a southerner, like James Best, but I found that really triggering because, okay, I get it. It's cold, there's snow on the ground. This is probably in some wooded area in upstate New York or something, and not a warmer climate like where I live. But ticks, dude, think of the ticks. So many ticks. They love piles of leaves. They love you. for dinner. And they will not leave after dinner because they still love you, because you're full of blood and you're tasty.
I knew that Carl's tourniquet would come in handy just to wipe the sweat and grime off your face, maybe to wipe a couple ticks off if they're just hanging around, dripping off of your forehead with the sweat and the grime. I mean, hey, wait a second. I did make those shots. Look at me. I can make it home. Screw you, self-doubt. Thank you, foreshadowing. I have to say, Milestone's inner monologue, Dick's inner monologue, it did feel like a step-by-step manual for if you were stuck out in the woods and you too were bitten by a rattlesnake, this is what you should do. Trust in your training. It will get you through the night. It may have you deliriously walk through the woods, but it will get you somewhere to safety somehow by something.
It reminds me of this tornado safety video that used to run in a loop on the local cable system for an entire... It would have started around this time of year and then run through April. The same tornado safety film on the hour, every hour. It was called Terrible Tuesday. It was about the Wichita Falls tornado of 79. And I could tell you that with such clarity because I saw it so many times. But I also remember this line from the little locally produced thing at the end of it, where they said, "Don't worry about getting dirty, just save your life."
Oh my, that's very severe. But maybe it's not as severe as how enthusiastic the toast was between Dick and Carl at the end when Carl's laid up in the hospital and Carl says his response to what Dick said about, well, would you run 12 miles just to save a friend? And then Dick, he kind of is poking fun at Carl, and Carl says, "Knock it off. You sound like a recruiting poster." Well, that's kind of the point of the episode, isn't it?
It's a moving recruiting poster, yes.
Big moment at the end, though. I mean, this is kind of like the Iceman and Maverick moment, although, not nearly as expertly done. Dick confesses that when he got hit in the nose the first time, he cried. But Carl snapped back, "Brother, as long as you swing back, nobody's gonna notice the tears." That's West Point 4. Suck it up, Buttercup.
Okay, this episode was a bit rougher to get through than Gene's previous West Point episodes. I don't know, how do you feel, Norm? Did you kind of land on the same square that I did, that this is really the weak one so far?
There's this kind of like understanding where you take a group of individual things and they're all of a certain quality, but one has to be the weakest. And I agree. I think that it's not, in my opinion, a weak episode. It's just by comparison to the other episodes that we have seen that are written by Gene for West Point, that this is considerably, not even just the weakest, but I think the most lopsided episode. Because there's so much happening to set up the story and not a lot happening to execute the payoff.
Right, and that was my big gripe. The first act is actually kind of strong. The first act was up there almost at the level of Gene's previous West Point scripts.
Mm-hmm.
The second act, it just kind of falls apart a bit. It's Dick Milestone talking to himself with reverb. Help me, Obi-Wan Carl, you're my only hope. Oh, wait, Obi-Wan me is my only hope. I get the point that the story is making, that the Army's basic training, even though this is the first time that Dick has had to put it into practice, that has provided him with the tools he needs to stay alive. But maybe there's a more elegant way, or a more interesting way, at the very least, that this could have been done. I try not to put on the writer's hat for Gene-ology, because this show is all about the writing. If we start second-guessing that, where's the show? But occasionally I will put on the story editor hat. And so, my thinking is, what if you made a character in that long first act, made a character out of one of the cadet instructors? maybe showing him at the firing range or something like, come on, Dick, you'll get better at this. Have that guy appear out of thin air and reiterate those key parts of the survival manual instead of Dick reciting them to himself, and then Dick looks up and the guy's gone.
Well, very much like the captain and, his trainee pilot in jet flight. Because, we had that moment where they were talking about asphyxiation, and then once the asphyxiation happened, that training kicked in because we saw it just happen.
Yes, and here's the thing about if Dick is imagining his instructor repeating this stuff to him, but the instructor's not really there, well, he's already feverish. He's probably hallucinating under the circumstances. Would this have been too weird for a 1957 audience to swallow? Is it too Twilight Zone?
No, and I think that's a really good point, because maybe we didn't get to see Dick in his head voice enough earlier on when he's saying the reason why I freeze up, the reason why I tie up when I'm at West Point is because I get too much into my head. And this would have been a really good way to show that he's in his head, but for a completely different reason.
Flag it down early in the script or something like, it's almost like I hear this voice in my head second-guessing me.
Yep.
That would have been good. Either that or it would have gotten him, out of the hunting trip and into the psych ward.
Well, I think that's where, in the fireside chat, I guess, if you will, between Carl and Dick, where he's just basically saying, I can do things when I'm not in my own head. When I'm just reacting to things organically and instinctually, then yeah, I can do things.
It just feels like Gene's brief was to talk about the Army survival training. And that creative brief may suggest a topic, but it doesn't suggest anything helpfully close to being a story. And as a result, this has really been the first of Gene's West Points that I've watched where it did not feel like he was fully in the driver's seat. It's like, okay, Gene, this week your assignment is to write a script that is about the Army's survival skills training. The first act is actually interesting. Gene's dangerously close to possibly making some kind of statement about privilege in there with, I've never had to fight for anything.
Great line. That was a great line, yeah.
I thought maybe, okay, we're going to talk about privilege in a city mouse versus country mouse kind of way. Or something that might rhyme with what Colonel Bellman was telling Leo Tanner about all the small-town kids joining the Army and the command. But after the act break, that all just evaporates. There's no more character development to speak of. It's just this side of, hey kids, you want to make your own sleeping bag out of leaves? Send 3 proofs of purchase and a self-addressed stamped envelope to the U.S. Army, and we'll send you instructions in 6 to 8 weeks, and it really, really works. And then we just find out at the end that Dick has magically managed to man up, or cowboy up, or whatever outdated phrase you want to call it. He started this episode as a real-life boy, but now he's a West Point man. So my main problems with this episode are structural. It feels like Gene was given a bunch of bullet points from Army survival training that he had to put in the show somehow, and it all happens in this internal monologue voiceover that just is not normally a feature of the show. And to me, this episode felt more out of step with the rest of West Point than the rom-com that we had in Double Reverse. Not every writer can stick every landing, I get it. Even though Gene is now a staff writer, which is a regular assignment that offers a bit of job security as opposed to freelancing, he's still not in a position to call all of his own shots, and this truly feels like a script that he had to cook from someone else's recipe.
Yeah, this is something that I also saw in the episode, where it felt very well scripted in the first half and very procedural in the second half. And the two halves, unfortunately, don't really complement each other. And I think that was, so far has been the strengths of all of the other episodes, that they've been really good first and second halves, where you set up the box in the first half and you open the box and have the resolution in that very clean, at least, it's at the end of the episode kind of way, which is very, typical of these short format shows. But they always seem to make sense from beginning to end in that complementary way. And this was a little bit, I think, again, not Gene's strongest script that we've seen so far. I do kind of want to point out that I found it curious that he named our hero character, Dick Milestone. Because it's not a name that rolls off the tongue. Milestone isn't a name that rolls off the tongue. So I'm like, okay, there's got to be a reason for it. And there's an obvious reason for it because the last name is fairly obvious for the etymology of his last name. So I looked at this Milestone on the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, and there are two entries. The first entry is not so relevant, but the second entry is a significant point in development. And I think that that's what we're experiencing with Dick here is that at the end of this episode, he has actually achieved, and I think that this is the hidden pun in his name, he's achieved a milestone in his development as a West Point man. He's able to rely on the skills that he's been trained. He's been able to, lean on the confidence that he never had, and he finally does because he was tested in a way that he's never been tested before. Mommy and Daddy, as he confessed, they set him up with a fairly plush lifestyle, enough to be able to find comfort where a lot of other kids had to fight for it. So I think if we did it, in today's kind of storytelling, it would be the rich kid that needs to fight his way and earn the respect of his peers. I mean, it's kind of Karate Kid-ish. Like I'm a fish out of water. I don't belong here. And now my confidence is shaken. But I need that one person to believe in me so that I can perform the way that I've been trained to perform. And I think in this case it'd be Carl, to Dick Milestone. What did you think about that? I mean, did you find his last name as obvious as I did?
Yeah, it stuck out like a sore thumb that Gene was trying to tell us, okay, this guy has passed a milestone.
Mm-hmm.
That
exactly.
being said, naming a character like that it's not bad. You and I saw it immediately. Audiences in 1957, I'm going to say, were not as media savvy as audiences today tend to be. And so they might have noticed it in real time, and then, the family sits around talking about West Point after the show is over. Oh, that was really clever that his name was Milestone.
It serves its purpose. And I think you're right, looking at it from the hindsight lenses, in place, it's easier to see some of these more obvious things than, say, someone who is watching TV or watching this particular episode for the first time in ever, and maybe having ever owned a TV in a year or two, based on when this came out. But there is something that I also wanted to kind of pivot towards, and this is a little section a little pun of my own that I entitled "Big Brother Knows Best." And this is about James Best. So James Best is Carl. And I think that he is, again, in this script, written in the tradition of the big brother / mentor / alpha in this episode. I'm using alpha in a very specific way, and I'll get to that in a second. And I find it interesting that in many or most of Gene's episodes of West Point, we always have the dynamic between an alpha and a beta. We have Hammeroff and Towns. We have Joel and Robert Hamilton. And just in the command, we have John Bellman and Leo Tanner. So just to lay the foundation for why I'm using the terms alpha and beta, so I looked this up, the alpha and beta male personality types, from an article on personalityunleashed.com. And in this article titled Beta versus Alpha Male, Understanding the Differences and Their Impact on Relationships. And I pulled several specific excerpts from the article because I felt that they described the situation in a very specific way. Alpha males are often seen as confident, assertive leaders who are comfortable taking charge in social situations. They tend to be physically strong, emotionally resilient, and highly competitive. In contrast, beta males are often seen as more introspective and sensitive, with a greater focus on building strong relationships and emotional connections. A beta male is seen as reserved, non-commanding person who falls into the second category in the hierarchy of males. They are not dominant or aggressive like alpha males, but they possess qualities such as friendliness, humility, and loyalty. Okay, so I think we're seeing the differences between some of the characters as they're paired in these episodes, especially, and I think specifically more in the command than anywhere else, because that is definitely Leo and John going at each other in an alpha-beta way. And as the beta starts growing into an alpha, and then the alpha relenting to becoming a beta, back and forth, that adds that really good narrative and that dynamic between those two characters. So I think that having shorthand in mind, this kind of shorthand in mind, watching these episodes, and maybe perhaps in the rewatches, we're seeing maybe a more of a subliminal dynamic in play here. And maybe Gene either had a supportive alpha male that helped him guide him, his career at one point in his life, or Gene was the alpha to a beta, or a combination of both, because it's possible that a beta to become an alpha, he needs to understand the struggle that the beta silently suffers based on their personality traits. And you might get that switch over. And I think that's what they're trying to do with these West Point characters who are almost just there, right? There's always that character that is just, you just need to find that connection, to unlock the potential inside, because he can be that guy. Is he willing to be that guy? And who's going to be the person that's going to show him the way? I think that's very consistent in Gene scripts.
I would love to get a look at the Writer's Bible that was distributed by Ziv to prospective writers on the show. Whether they were freelancers, whether it was people on staff like Gene, whether it was the story editor. I wondered if it was baked into the cake that every story's got to have, as you put it, alpha or beta, or older brother, younger brother, mentor and mentee. However you want to put it. I wonder if that was actually part of the show's format. Because since it's about the U.S. Army, and since the show was being made in 1956 and 57, it's going to be a sausage fest every time. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It's going to be 2 male leads. Knowing that going in, it would not be unreasonable if the format of the show basically demanded that all writers hew to big brother and little brother, older, younger, more experienced, less experienced, wherever the dividing line is, someone is going to learn something about themselves by the end of this 25 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was also part of kind of like the patriarchal culture of the time. We always talk about the masculinity script, and, that's something that's, again, it's a very good reference in terms of understanding kind of like the pecking order of how men were raised at this time or earlier. There's always, if the father can't do it, then the older son is trained to do it. If the older son can't do it, then the younger son is trained to do it. If you're fortunate enough to have that hierarchy in your family, like we saw with the Hamiltons, older father always kept everything buttoned up, professional, emotionally boxed in. But he did train his sons to think about it in a certain way, to understand duty, honor, family, and things of that nature. And then it just went from, you saw it how it came a little bit more distilled, though, from man to man to man. Again, using the Hamiltons, father was very, well decorated but quiet. Joel, the older brother, not as much, but still very reserved. And then obviously saying, and Robert, the younger brother, is a little bit more on the rebellious side, because he's two not generations, but 2 steps away from the source material. Right. So he's not getting the lessons directly from the father. He's getting the lessons from his older brother. So, I mean, when you're really looking at it, it's a Denethor, Boromir, Faramir situation, if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, they're kind of playing telephone with life lessons. Speaking of the masculinity script, I'm glad you brought that up, and it is a topic on this show frequently, because we're in this era of TV where, for better or worse, as a function of the times in which the shows were made, your lead characters are basically all men. There's a line that Carl says when they're having their fireside chat that really struck me. There's not a man living who doesn't get scared once in a while. And I wondered if this was kind of like Jet Flight, where maybe Gene is letting a little bit of air out of the tires of the masculinity script and saying, okay, a little bit of doubt is perfectly natural. You don't have to convince yourself that you have no fear. It's okay to have the fear. It's how you respond to it that matters.
So here we are, Earl, at the end of our manhunt, and we've checked every boathouse and outhouse and all those other cool houses that Tommy Lee Jones's character said at the end of The Fugitive, because I can't say it nearly as eloquently, but you know what I mean. And it has absolutely nothing to do with that kind of manhunt. We found our man, we brought him back, and it turns out he hit a milestone. Hooray, hooray. Hold the applause, please.
And the good news is, I thought it was kind of neat, the whole first aid scene. Probably would have been a lot gorier if it was done today. It showed just enough for 1957 and, showed that it wasn't easy, it wasn't painless, but that something was being done. There is a procedure to follow. Mm-hmm. I thought that was kind of cool.
So at the end of all of our mission log shows, what we do is we take a look at the episode in total and see, especially with Gene scripts, since that's what we do here on Gene-ology, we take a look at Gene scripts and see if there is a through line or development process happening that takes us to the logical conclusion of his most famous work. Did we find any specific morals, meanings, or messages contained in this episode, in the Manhunt? Did we find any, Earl? What did you hunt down?
I think I may have found something that wasn't exactly what this script is hunting for, so you may have to forgive me if there is a little bit of interpretation on my part. Because the message the script leaves us with, the message the show leaves us with, really, because we're not dealing with the script here. As long as you swing back, nobody's going to notice the tears. Now, Carl says this to Dick when they are, both in the infirmary. Dick's paying Carl a visit in the infirmary because, who knew, just from exposure to the elements, Carl is in worse shape than the guy who got bitten by a rattlesnake. I did not have that on my bingo card. I expect both these guys to be laid out for about a week.
I think I had a problem with that scene, too. It didn't seem very clear that Carl was really putting himself at that much risk.
Yeah, maybe they should have had him be a lot more sniffly or have him already coughing and sneezing or something. Because, as Cadet Lieutenant Thompson points out at the beginning of the show, the uniform does help you, but it doesn't do everything for you. There's some stuff you've got to do yourself. But anyway, at the end of the show, we're chuckling, we're having a little toast in the infirmary. Here's to the day that a punch got landed on your nose, and you punched back. And Dick says, "Oh yeah, but I cried." Carl says, "As long as you swing back, nobody's going to notice the tears." Gene, is that the message? Seriously? I mean, okay, we were going to bump into something like this sooner or later. It's worth pointing out, the masculinity script we so often reference in Gene-ology is a mindset under which Gene Roddenberry was raised as a young man. Either in his own upbringing or in life in the military. We have seen a few instances of Gene kind of poking holes in the masculinity script that has been brought up so often. Which, to be clear, we started talking about the masculinity script in, was it episode 2 of this podcast? And it keeps coming up because so many of these shows are male-led, and they keep reiterating various points of the masculinity script. All of this stiff upper lip stuff. Here it may seem like Gene is propping up the masculinity script, but it feels like maybe the real message has gotten obscured, which is, keep your wits about you. Don't lose your head. Keep your cool. Freaking out is the enemy of getting stuff done. Sometimes the stuff that needs to get done is the first order of business, staying alive.
Well, I do agree with you on very many points that you're making here. Sometimes I'm like, is Gene being this obvious, or is he being obvious and then subverting it at the end in some way? And I think that I'm finding a lot of Gene's subversions throughout the course of what looks like to be a very obvious narrative. And this is where I'm looking into what I believe is something that's very cleverly weaved into this story, and a lot of his scripts too, especially West Point scripts. Reverse psychology as it applies to the masculine psyche. Now, I want to put a disclaimer out there. I am not a trained psychiatrist. I am not a trained counselor or mental health professional at all. These are my observations about what I believe Gene is presenting us in this episode and how it applies to the context of men from that era, from the 1950s, from the masculinity script era. So during the rifle training sequence in the mountains, There's a scene, a tough love scene from Carl, or as they say through the masculinity vernacular, give yourself a kick in the pants, kid. Toughen up. Get mad at yourself for being weak. Now, I know that this was probably the dynamic between men at the time, and certainly the dynamic between a superior or an alpha to an inferior or a beta, where the inferior self-sabotages because they may never measure up to their superior until they are given the opportunity to pass or fail on their own merit. This is what Dick Milestone suffered through, to understand that he actually does have worth. So there's something to be said about that. It's not a failure of leadership for the superior, and it's certainly not a failure of maturity for the inferior. And it is better to find these strengths and weaknesses out sooner than later, because something may not be able to be reconciled, i.e. someone may get hurt, harmed, killed, or worse, if you don't own up to your strengths and weaknesses. Now, Milestone did confesses to the fact that he was raised by good and caring parents, and that may have made him soft, to the point where Carl can't even get a rise out of him. But there's no shame in being raised that way. The issue is that not everyone is made for an institution like West Point, or military academies like Annapolis, or the Citadel, or even like general military service. There's a difference in believing that you can make it there and actually making it there. Sometimes the fit will never be right. Now, in this episode, of course, Gene is making the argument that Milestone really does have what it takes and just needs to be pushed in a very specific way that even he doesn't realize. And I do see this as a positive point. And this plays into what I think is most revealing about one of Dick's confessions at the fireside chat, and what I believe Carl was trying to pull out of him in the rifle sequence. I never needed anything. I've never had to fight for anything. Now, on a personal note, there's something that I learned on the job when it came to understanding my own self-worth. You can't teach someone to have passion, or to have fire in the belly, as they say. You have to learn that on your own. Either you have it, or you don't. There's no shame in it. But it does teach you that if you're in the right environment to thrive and grow and discover your own self-worth, then that's the place you need to be. The issue here is that Dick thinks that West Point is that environment. Maybe. But I think, more importantly, that West Point is the environment where a Dick Milestone can meet a Carl who will help him in ways that he least expected. So I think that looking at this in a more positive frame and seeing like what maybe they were trying to tell in their story at the time, that there is a big brother, or there is a mentor, or there is somebody that's looking out for you that will help you achieve what you need to or want to be, even if you don't see that in yourself. But again, that can be also arguably a weakness like that we see today, where too many people are a little too tough and expecting too much and not understanding the real inner workings of somebody. And we probably saw that, most demonstratively in Full Metal Jacket, when Gomer Pyle, played by Vincent D'Onofrio, is a model trainee until he wasn't.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry repertory players. Our cast this week featured, us. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, McKinley's Challenge.
Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takachi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.